Okay, 7.8 notes, graphing cosine functions, page 24 in your notes. We're going to connect the unit circle to the graph of the cosine function and then shift cosine graphs. So if you graph a triangle in the unit circle, where this is the angle theta, the radius in the unit circle is 1. This is your x coordinate, this is your y coordinate in the unit circle. If you're looking for the cosine ratio today, cosine is cut a over h. So it's adjacent over hypotenuse. So it's x over 1. So the cosine ratio is equivalent to the x coordinate in the unit circle. So if we graph the 4 points that are on the axes, like so, we're going to find the cosine ratio today. So at 0 radians over here, cosine is cut, a over h. So we have 1 divided by 1, which is 1. Notice this is different than the lesson before. It was at 0, 0. So this time the graph is starting at 1 instead of 0. Now at pi over 2, which is at 90 degrees, cosine is cut, a over h. So 0 divided by 1 is 0. At pi, cosine is a over h, so negative 1 over 1, which is negative 1. At 1.5 pi, it's 0 over 1, which is 0. And then at 2 pi, we're back here again, so it's 1 over 1, which is 1. So this pattern is now repeating. So we have 0, negative 1, 0, 1 to complete our pattern. So for cosine, you actually are starting at the amplitude, then you go to 0, then the amplitude, and then back to 0. So the graph is going to look different. So if we were to graph this, we scale our x values, and then the side here is going to be the cosine ratio values. So at 0 radians, we had a cosine ratio of 1, and then 0, negative 1, 0, 1, 0, negative 1, 0, 1. So your cosine ratio looks like this. It does not start at 0, 0. It starts instead on the amplitude. So notice that your domain, you could have gone around and around that circle, so it would be all real numbers. Your range is from negative 1 to 1. Your period, in order for it to repeat, notice it's starting at the top and then to the top. Your period is still 2 pi, just like it is with sine. Your amplitude, the height from the x-axis, is still 1. But this graph doesn't go through the origin. Instead, it's here. Notice that it would have symmetry with the y-axis, so this is an even function. When you shift cosine, it's exactly like shifting sine. The only real difference is where you start. You don't start at 0, 0, you start at the amplitude. So you still have the amplitude, absolute value of the number in front. If it's negative, it flips on the x-axis. Your period is still 2 pi divided by the number of x's. You set the parentheses equal to 0 for your phase shift. And then the number at the end is your vertical shift, whether it goes up or down. So for our first example, for our period, you do 2 pi divided by the number of x's. There's only one x. So I get 2 pi. Your amplitude is the absolute value of the number in front, so absolute value of 3 is 3. There is no phase shift, there's no parentheses, there's no vertical shift, there's no number on the end. So without a phase shift, you're going to start at 0, 0. Then you add your period, so 0 plus 2 pi is 2 pi. Now we're going to scale this. Halfway in between is pi, halfway in between is half a pi. Add these up, take half, you get 3 pi over 2. I'm going to count by 1 over here. You have to pay attention. This is a cosine graph. So I'm not starting at 0, 0. Instead, I'm starting on the amplitude of 3. Then you go to 0. Then you go to the amplitude, 0, amplitude. Do not let your graph look like a V. It's a curved graph, so try to curve it if at all possible. So that's what your graph should look like. For b, your period is 2 pi divided by the number of x's, 1. So you're going to get 2 pi. And then your amplitude, take the absolute value of the number in front, you get 2. But because it's negative, there is a flip on the x-axis. There's no phase shift or vertical shift. So that means we're starting at 0. And then you add your period. So 0 plus 2 pi is 2 pi. We're going to scale this. So this is pi, half a pi. Add them up, take half, you get 3 pi over 2. Scaling the left side. Since it's cosine, you're going to start on the amplitude. But there's a flip, so instead of starting at 2, I'm going to start at negative 2. Then you go to 0. This is going to flip up to positive 2, 0, and then flip to negative 2. So your graph should look like this. All right, state the amplitude, period, phase shift, and vertical shift. So the amplitude is the absolute value of the number in front, so 2. Your period is 2 pi divided by the number of x's. There's only one x, so 2 pi divided by 1 is 2 pi. Your phase shift, there are no parentheses, so there is no phase shift. And then your vertical shift is the number on the end, so we're going to go down 5. All right, number 4 is, what is the amplitude of this graph? All right, hopefully you got that it's the absolute value of 2, which is 2. What is the period? All right, it's 2 pi divided by 2 x's, so you should get pi. What is the phase shift? Okay, so setting the parentheses equal to 0, you should get pi over 4. I fraction busted. And then vertical shift. Okay, the number on the end, we're going to go up 1. So we start our graph on our phase shift. So this is going to be pi over 4. Then you add your phase shift and your period to figure out where you end. Notice you need a common denominator. So this is 4 pi over 4 plus 1 pi over 4, which makes 5 pi over 4. Now we have to scale our graph at the bottom. So we're going to add these up and take half. So I get 6 pi over 4, which reduces to 3 pi over 2. Take half, you get 3 pi over 4. If I add these guys, that's 4 pi over 4, which is just pi. Take half, it's pi over 2. Adding these, I get 8 pi over 4, which is 2 pi. Take half, I get 1 pi. Scale the left side. This is cosine, so you're going to start on the amplitude. And then you go to 0, down to the amplitude, 0, up to the amplitude. But we have a vertical shift, so from each of those points, I'm going to go up 1. So that is my final graph. All right, part B, what is the amplitude of this graph? Okay, hopefully you got 1, but there is a flip because it is negative. What is the period? Okay, so it's 2 pi divided by 1/4 x's. When you divide by a fourth, you multiply by its reciprocal, so you should get 8 pi. What is the phase shift? Okay, setting the parentheses equal to 0, you should get negative 2 pi. What is the vertical shift? Okay, so down to it's the number on the end. So putting this together, you start graphing on your phase shift, and then you add your phase shift and period. So negative 2 pi plus 8 pi is 6 pi. Now we're going to scale this, add them up, take half. So if I add them, I get 4 pi. Take half, you get 2 pi. Add these up, you get 0, half of 0 is 0. Add these up, I get 8 pi, halfway is 4 pi. Scale the left side. It's cosine, so we start on the amplitude of 1, but we're going to flip to negative 1. Then 0, then flip up to 1, 0, negative 1. And then from those points, I'm going to go down 2. And that is the graph for B.